By late summer 1944, the map of Europe was changing faster than anyone had dared hope. France was opening, cities were being liberated, and the German army was in retreat across ground it had once claimed as permanent. Newspapers spoke the language of momentum. Headlines suggested inevitability. To the public eye, the war now appeared to be entering its final act. Yet behind those headlines, the boards that tracked casualties continued to fill with names. In London, Winston Churchill read two kinds of reports each day. One described progress: ports reopened, railways seized, flags raised over town halls that had lived under occupation for 4 years. The other was quieter and more precise: infantry battalions reduced to fractions of their original strength, replacement drafts consumed almost as soon as they arrived, formations that existed on paper but not in spirit. Victory, it seemed, was advancing, but it was not growing cheaper. Across the Channel, the contrast within the Allied armies was becoming impossible to ignore. On the northern front, Bernard Montgomery's forces pressed forward with deliberation, grinding against prepared German defenses, measuring success in yards taken and positions held. The cost was predictable and heavy. In the south, George Patton's Third Army moved with speed that bordered on disbelief, turning German withdrawal into collapse, covering distances that made planners uneasy. One front consumed men, the other consumed miles. To Churchill, this was not merely a military contrast, it was a political one. In Parliament, questions sharpened. If the war was being won, why did it still feel so expensive? Why did sacrifice appear to deepen just as hope was supposed to arrive? Democracies, Churchill knew, did not survive on outcomes alone. They required explanations, narratives that connected loss to purpose. Without that connection, even success could curdle into doubt. The deeper truth, visible now for the first time after Normandy, was that coalition war fought on two fronts at once, one against the enemy, the other within the alliance itself. Pride, reputation, and national standing moved beneath every operational decision. A British commander criticized too openly became more than a military problem. He became a question about Britain's place in the war. Churchill understood that managing this balance would define the months ahead. Triumph, after all, was no longer enough. Triumph had to be explained, defended, and shared. And so the story begins not at the moment of invasion, but at the moment of supposed success, when winning demanded a public meaning, and when the cost of that meaning was still being paid in blood. Bernard Montgomery fought war as weight. His method was deliberate, almost architectural: hold ground, accumulate force, and apply pressure until the enemy cracked from exhaustion rather than surprise. It was a way of fighting shaped by memory, the Somme, Passchendaele, and the knowledge that Britain no longer possessed men to waste on improvisation. Every attack was prepared. Every gain was meant to be held. Progress was measured not by speed, but by survival. George Patton fought war as motion. He believed momentum itself was a weapon. That shock, penetration, and relentless pursuit could unbalance an enemy faster than firepower alone. Where Montgomery paused to consolidate, Patton accelerated to disorient. He sought not the careful reduction of German strength, but its psychological collapse. In Patton's world, hesitation was danger, and stillness invited recovery. Above them sat Dwight Eisenhower, tasked with turning these opposing temperaments into a single campaign. Strategy in his hands became geometry. Montgomery anchored the line, absorbing pressure and fixing German forces in place. Patton became the blade, cutting where resistance thinned, exploiting openings before they could be sealed. On paper, it was complementary. In practice, it demanded restraint from men who believed deeply in their own methods. Churchill watched this balance with unease. To him, the alliance was not an abstraction, but a living organism, sensitive to slights, vulnerable to imbalance. If it fractured, victory would still be possible, but it would arrive stripped of meaning and burdened with resentment. A triumph won alone would be a debt Britain could not afford. The deeper tension lay beneath doctrine. Britain fought with scarcity. Its army was experienced, disciplined, and finite. Every battalion lost echoed loudly at home. America fought with abundance. Men, fuel, machines arriving faster than commanders could absorb them, and each side resented how the other spent its strength. British caution looked like timidity. American speed looked like recklessness. On the ground, strategy felt different. A British infantryman, soaked and exhausted, learned what holding pressure meant as another night in the mud under artillery fire. An American tanker, engines silent for lack of fuel, learned what momentum meant by waiting helplessly on a roadside while opportunity passed him by. Both paid the same bill. Neither had written it. Churchill understood where this was heading. His coming words would not be aimed primarily at Berlin. They would be aimed inward, at preventing success from becoming accusation, and preventing allies from mistaking difference for betrayal, because the enemy was weakening. But the alliance, if mishandled, could weaken faster. After D-Day, the battle for Caen became more than a tactical objective. Planned as a city to be taken within days, it instead hardened into a symbol of the campaign's grinding reality. German defenses held stubbornly. British and Canadian units advanced yard by yard through hedgerows and shattered villages, paying in casualties for ground that barely registered on maps. What had been designed as maneuver began to feel like attrition. South and west of Caen, another presence loomed, one not yet unleashed. George Patton's name, carefully hidden before the landings to deceive the Germans, now carried a different weight. To American officers and soldiers alike, it became a promise deferred. If speed could break this stalemate, then Patton was its embodiment. The longer he remained constrained, the louder the unspoken question grew. British losses continued to accumulate. Infantry companies rotated through the line already under strength, learning that Normandy's hedgerows favored the defender and punished the attacker. Across the Atlantic and within American ranks, frustration sharpened, not only at the pace of advance, but at the explanations offered for it. Victory, so recently proclaimed inevitable, was proving slow and expensive. Churchill felt the danger instinctively. To criticize a British commander too openly was not merely a military judgment. It risked becoming a national humiliation. Montgomery was not just a general. He was a symbol of Britain's competence, discipline, and relevance in a war now dominated by American power. Any public doubt would echo far beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower's dilemma grew sharper with each report. He needed Montgomery's steadiness to anchor the front, to hold German armor in place and prevent collapse. But he also needed Patton's speed, the kind of operational violence that could turn pressure into breakthrough. Without both, the campaign risked stagnation. With both, it risked comparison. Inside headquarters, the contrast became surreal. Staff meetings unfolded over calm, orderly maps marked with tidy arrows and phase lines. Outside those rooms, casualty lists arrived with mechanical regularity, like bad weather that could not be postponed or reasoned with. The arithmetic of Normandy was slow, and it was unforgiving. The cracks were still small, barely visible to the public. But they were forming. Soon, winning would no longer be judged solely by ground taken, but by whose method was blamed for the cost of taking it. Operation Cobra shattered the illusion of permanence along the German line. After weeks of attrition in the Norman hedgerows, American air power and concentrated force tore open a seam near St. Lo, and through that opening poured motion. What followed was not a gradual advance, but a transformation. The battlefield changed character. Resistance that had once absorbed pressure now dissolved under speed. George Patton's Third Army surged forward as if released from restraint. Columns advanced day and night, bypassing strong points, overrunning rear areas, turning organized withdrawal into collapse. Towns fell in rapid succession: Avranches, Rennes, Le Mans, names that marked distance rather than difficulty. German units, trained to respond to pressure with counter-pressure, found themselves unbalanced by pursuit. They were not being defeated methodically. They were being outrun. With every mile gained came a belief that felt almost irresistible. If movement could do this, if speed alone could unravel an enemy, then perhaps the war itself could be ended by momentum. Patton's advance did more than seize ground. It altered expectation. The idea of a long, grinding campaign suddenly felt obsolete, even unnecessary. That belief carried a moral weight. Patton's victories became an unspoken question aimed at every other front. If one commander could move with such effect, why could the rest not do the same? Caution, once defended as prudence, now risked being interpreted as inertia. The comparison was no longer theoretical. It was visible on maps updated daily. Churchill watched this shift with mixed emotion. He admired the audacity, the clarity of result, the way Patton's advance seemed to simplify the war. Yet he also sensed the danger forming in the narrative. British caution, born of experience, scarcity, and memory, was now being judged beside American audacity. What had once been complementary styles threatened to become moral opposites. But speed carried its own hidden costs. As Third Army raced eastward, its supply lines stretched thinner with every success. Fuel trucks lagged behind armored columns. Ammunition dumps fell farther to the rear. Victory began to consume the very resources required to sustain it. Momentum, if not fed, could turn brittle. Along French roadsides, mechanics worked under open skies, keeping tanks alive with improvised repairs, cannibalizing disabled vehicles so others could continue. Engines were coaxed, not maintained. In headquarters, the debate shifted from where to advance next to who would receive gasoline tomorrow. Strategy narrowed into logistics, and logistics into argument. None of this slowed the optimism. France was opening, and with it came promises, spoken carefully in public, more boldly in private. Leaders began to speak of timelines that assumed roads without congestion, depots without limits, and enemies without the capacity to recover. The arithmetic of success was being rewritten on the fly. What they did not yet confront was the oldest truth of modern war. Movement creates appetite, and appetite, if left unsatisfied, can undo the very victories that created it. As Patton's army pushed forward, faster than plans had anticipated, the Allies approached a moment where triumph would have to choose its direction, and where speed would demand a price no one was fully prepared to pay. By early September 1944, the Allied advance had moved faster than its own ability to sustain it. The front surged eastward across France, but the supply pipeline lagged far behind, stretched from the beaches of Normandy and the limited ports still being repaired. Gasoline, once assumed plentiful, became the decisive factor. German bullets mattered less than the absence of fuel to pursue a retreating enemy. This scarcity forced a question that no coalition could avoid. Bernard Montgomery argued for concentration, a single powerful thrust in the north that would break into Germany and end the war by decision. George Patton argued for pressure everywhere, continuous movement across the front that denied the enemy recovery and turned retreat into disintegration. Both plans claimed logic. Both demanded priority. Eisenhower's command philosophy favored balance. He believed in keeping the enemy under pressure along the entire front, denying him the chance to regroup. But balance required resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantity. Reality intruded with brutal simplicity. Someone would be fed. Someone would be slowed. Strategy narrowed into allocation. Almost immediately, pride attached itself to logistics. British confidence gathered around the Northern Plan, which promised clarity and a visible path to victory. American pride gathered around Patton's momentum, which already seemed to prove what speed could achieve if left unrestrained. What began as an operational debate hardened into something closer to identity. Churchill watched the geometry of the problem and saw its danger. If Montgomery was denied the resources he requested, Britain would appear secondary, its principal commander checked at the moment of opportunity. If Patton was denied fuel, America would feel constrained, its energy throttled by caution that looked foreign to its temperament. Either choice risked turning allies into critics. The consequences reached the front with quiet cruelty. Elements of Patton's Third Army rolled forward until they could roll no farther. Tanks sat along French roads, engines silent, crews waiting not for orders but for gasoline. There was no enemy contact, no defeat to explain the halt. Victory itself had paused, held hostage by supply columns that could not arrive in time. For the men on the ground, this felt like contradiction made physical. They had broken through. They had outrun resistance, and now they waited, immobilized by success. The war had not stopped them. Their own momentum had. Behind the scenes, depots and railheads became the true battlefield. Decisions made in offices determined which armies would move and which would stand still. The map no longer showed only divisions and arrows. It showed priorities, and the resentments those priorities would create. The revelation was unavoidable, though rarely stated aloud. In modern war, decisive moments are not always found at the front. They are often decided miles behind it, in warehouses, rail yards, and fuel dumps, where victory must choose a direction before it can choose an enemy. And as that choice loomed, the alliance moved closer to a gamble that promised resolution, but carried a cost no ledger could yet fully calculate. Operation Market Garden was presented as clarity itself. Airborne forces would seize a chain of bridges deep inside the Netherlands. Armored columns would race north along a single highway, cross the Rhine, and open a direct path into Germany's industrial heartland. It was a plan that promised compression, distance, time, and sacrifice reduced to one decisive movement. In a war that had grown complex and expensive, simplicity carried its own appeal. For Churchill, the proposal held a different power. Britain needed an ending the public could recognize, not another ledger of ground gained, but a stroke that made the long cost of war feel purposeful and finite. Market Garden sounded like a conclusion. It offered a picture that could be understood beyond maps and staff papers, a leap, a crossing, a moment where history turned. Montgomery's confidence in the plan became political capital. He spoke with assurance, framing the operation as a logical extension of success already achieved. To question him too openly was to risk questioning Britain itself, its judgment, its competence, its place at the center of Allied command. In a coalition strained by comparison, his certainty mattered almost as much as the plan. Yet the fragility was visible to anyone willing to look closely. The operation depended on precision across every phase. Airborne drops had to land intact. Bridges had to be seized quickly and held. A narrow corridor, one raised road, vulnerable on both sides, had to carry armor, fuel, and reinforcements without interruption. And the enemy, though retreating, was not broken. German units still existed, still reacted, still learned. This was the moral seduction of the one last push. When a nation is tired, it becomes receptive to endings that promise release. Exhaustion sharpens belief. Risk begins to look like resolve. The difference between confidence and necessity grows thin. Inside the aircraft, paratroopers packed light. They joked, smoked, checked equipment with ritual calm. No one could carry dread for hours without breaking, and so humor did its quiet work. The men knew the outline of the plan, but not its contingencies. They understood only that they would be dropped far ahead of friendly lines, tasked with holding ground until help arrived. Churchill weighed all of this from a distance. He knew the appeal of boldness. He also knew the cost when boldness failed. To bless the operation was to endorse its promise. To withhold support was to fracture unity at the moment action was demanded. Leadership offered no clean ground here, only choices between imperfect responsibilities. Market Garden moved forward with momentum that felt inevitable once set in motion. The language around it hardened into confidence. The public heard of daring. The planners spoke of speed. What no one could yet know was whether this shortcut would lead to Germany, or to a reckoning that would force Churchill to answer for a gamble he had not designed, but had allowed. And soon, that answer would be demanded not in speeches, but in lives. The airborne landings began with a mixture of precision and disorder. On some objectives, paratroopers moved with remarkable speed, securing bridges and crossroads before German units could react. On others, drops scattered, units arrived late, and resistance formed faster than expected. From the opening hours, success and delay existed side by side, inseparable and already shaping the outcome. Arnhem soon absorbed the weight of the operation. The bridge over the lower Rhine was the final prize, the point on which every timetable depended. A small British force reached it quickly and held, but isolation followed almost immediately. Reinforcements moved too slowly. Communication frayed. What had been a bold advance narrowed into a single exposed struggle, concentrated around one objective that consumed men faster than help could reach them. The corridor leading north became a choking artery. One raised road carried everything: armor, fuel, medical evacuation, command. Each blown culvert, each ambush, each disabled vehicle reduced flow and increased delay. Time itself became the enemy. Every hour lost along that road translated into lives lost at Arnhem, where defenders waited for relief that receded with every interruption. Here, the operation met the hard truth of engineering. Radios failed in built-up terrain. Weather grounded resupply aircraft or scattered their loads. Roads bottlenecked under traffic they were never designed to carry. Modern warfare, for all its scale and ambition, proved vulnerable to small mechanical facts that no amount of courage could overcome. Within Arnhem, the perimeter contracted steadily. Houses, gardens, and rubble became successive lines of defense. Ammunition ran low. Wounded filled improvised aid stations. Courage took on a quieter form, not charging forward, but holding ground and waiting for help that might not arrive. The men fought with the knowledge that the plan required precision they could no longer supply. When the operation finally failed, the cost could not be softened by language. Thousands were dead, missing, wounded, or captured. Entire airborne formations ceased to exist as fighting units. What had been promised as a shortcut hardened into loss, measured not in yards or bridges, but in absence. The news traveled quickly, even before official statements were shaped. Market Garden had not ended the war. It had ended something else, the belief that confidence alone could bend reality. For Churchill, the crisis now became personal and political at once. The disaster had unfolded under Britain's most famous field commander, with British soldiers paying heavily for its failure. The question before him was no longer operational. It was rhetorical. What could be said, truthfully, usefully, and without tearing the alliance apart, about a defeat that the nation had been encouraged to believe in? When Churchill rose to speak after Arnhem, the words he chose were measured with unusual care. Parliament, and the nation beyond it, waited not only for explanation, but for reassurance that the war still made sense. Defeat, left unframed, could rot morale faster than any military reverse. Churchill understood that language itself had become a form of command. He began with praise. The airborne soldiers were described with precision and dignity. Their courage, their endurance, the severity of the conditions they faced. Their losses were acknowledged, but not as waste. To allow sacrifice to appear purposeless was politically lethal. Men could die in great numbers, but only if their deaths were made to belong to something larger than miscalculation. Churchill spoke as though the operation had achieved a strategic bound. He emphasized the distance gained, the pressure maintained on the enemy, the broader continuity of Allied advance. The words did not deny failure outright, but they reframed it as limitation rather than collapse. To listeners, something felt misaligned. The public could sense that a decisive promise had not been fulfilled, even if the precise contours of the failure remained obscured. Here lay a deeper truth about coalition war. Leaders sometimes defend a plan not because it succeeded, but because the alliance cannot afford the spectacle of self-condemnation. To publicly dismantle Montgomery's judgment would have been to dismantle Britain's confidence in its own command, at a moment when unity mattered more than accuracy. Across Britain, families read official phrases with careful attention. They searched for meaning between the lines, measuring reassurance against silence. Phrases like heavy losses and gallant effort carried weight because they carried ambiguity. What the words concealed was often as important as what they revealed. Inside staff headquarters, a different conversation unfolded. Maps were revisited, assumptions were examined. The narrow road, the underestimated enemy strength, the fragile communications, these were spoken of plainly behind closed doors. A gap widened between the public story and the private reckoning, and those who occupied that space learned to live with the tension. Churchill was not unaware of this division. He accepted it as a cost of leadership in wartime. Truth, he believed, had to be rationed as carefully as fuel. Too much, delivered without context, could stall the national will as surely as any defeat. In this sense, his words became a shield. Not primarily for Montgomery's pride, nor even for the plan itself, but for Britain's ability to continue the war without losing faith in its own judgment. Arnhem had failed, but the war required that failure be absorbed, not allowed to dominate. What remained unresolved was how long such language could hold, especially as comparisons sharpened elsewhere, and as another commander, fighting under different constraints, continued to produce results that words alone could not explain. While the North bled from Arnhem's failure, the war in the South took on a different character. In Lorraine, Patton fought under restrictions that should have stopped him. Fuel allocations were cut, priorities redirected, movement officially limited. Yet movement continued. Units advanced, not because supply allowed it, but because Patton improvised where doctrine expected pause. Progress became uneven, episodic, and still unmistakable. Each local success sharpened the political contrast. Patton advanced despite scarcity. Montgomery had consumed resources despite failure. The phrasing did not originate in orders or communiques. It emerged in mess tents, in letters home, in the tone of briefings that no longer pretended neutrality. Comparison had become unavoidable, and comparison rarely remains fair. Eisenhower's coalition logic now collided openly with battlefield emotion. Strategy argued for balance, restraint, and long-term cohesion. Soldiers experienced none of that. They experienced delay, advance, and denial in immediate terms. To them, equity mattered more than geometry. An army stalled for lack of fuel did not feel strategically managed. It felt neglected. Here lay another uncomfortable truth. Victory can create bitterness as efficiently as defeat. Success invites explanation, and explanation seeks responsibility. When things go wrong, blame looks backward. When things go right under unequal conditions, blame looks sideways. Patton's continued movement under constraint became less a solution than a provocation. On the ground, the imbalance was measured precisely. American units rationed fuel by the gallon, calculating advances by how far a tank could roll before running dry. Engines were shut down whenever possible. Routes were chosen not for tactical advantage, but for economy. Meanwhile, British units rationed explanations by the sentence, defending decisions that no longer aligned cleanly with outcomes. Churchill watched Washington's mood harden. Admiration for Patton grew into something sharper. What began as respect for audacity evolved into accusation, an unspoken question about why American energy appeared constrained while British command remained protected. The alliance was winning the war, but the narrative of how it was being won was drifting apart. Phrases hardened into assumptions. This was not yet rupture. Cooperation continued, orders were followed, but confidence, the quiet belief that the system was fair, had begun to thin. Resentment settled into the spaces where clarity had once lived. And even as German forces continued to retreat, something dangerous was forming. The enemy, watching Allied confidence stretch itself thin, prepared a response not aimed at territory alone. They would strike where the alliance felt strongest. They would strike at confidence itself. In December 1944, the German army struck back through the Ardennes with a violence that felt unreal. Snow-covered forests, long considered unsuitable for large-scale armor, erupted with movement as panzer divisions pushed westward. Allied assumptions about enemy exhaustion, about the war's approaching end, collapsed in a matter of hours. What had felt like momentum turned overnight into panic. The offensive was more than tactical. It was psychological by design. Hitler aimed not simply to seize ground, but to fracture confidence, to split Allied armies, strain their cooperation, and force negotiations before Germany's collapse became final. The Ardennes was chosen precisely because it preyed on belief. It attacked where vigilance had thinned and certainty had taken root. For Eisenhower, the crisis was immediate and consuming. The front bent unpredictably, communications failed, units vanished into fog and forest. Decisions were made with incomplete information and no margin for delay. Command became less a matter of brilliance than endurance, a test of nerves under pressure that allowed no rehearsal. In the North, Montgomery was given authority to restore order among American units pushed back by the initial assault. Militarily, the decision made sense. Symbolically, it cut deep. Americans bristled not only at the necessity, but at what it appeared to imply, that British command was once again being placed over American forces at a moment of humiliation. The wound was emotional, not operational, and therefore harder to cauterize. On the ground, the experience stripped language of comfort. Frozen infantry clung to shallow positions, uncertain whether they were flanks or islands. Roads jammed with retreating vehicles, refugees, and counter-attacking columns all at once. Men learned what breakthrough felt like, not as movement forward, but as being erased from the map by forces they could not see. The weather compounded everything. Snow grounded aircraft. Fog hid armor until it was close enough to hear. The battlefield became intimate and disorienting, a place where survival depended less on plans than on resilience. The enemy had chosen his moment well. Churchill watched the unfolding crisis with acute awareness. This was not merely a military emergency, it was a political tremor. If Allied unity snapped now, after so much sacrifice and so many promises, the war's end would not be written in surrender documents. It would be negotiated under duress, with consequences no one could fully predict. Yet within the danger lay a brutal clarity. The Ardennes stripped away illusion. It revealed what the alliance truly was when pressed, not a collection of doctrines or reputations, but a system forced to respond together or fail separately. As the front stabilized inch by inch, a larger question emerged from the snow and smoke. The Germans had delivered shock with precision. Now the burden shifted. Who, in this moment of exposure, would prove that the coalition could absorb catastrophe without breaking and turn crisis back into control? When the German offensive cut deep into the Ardennes, Patton did not hesitate. Third Army pivoted north in one of the war's most demanding operational turns. An entire force redirected under winter conditions against an advancing enemy, with fuel scarce and roads choked by snow and traffic. It required discipline as much as audacity, and an acceptance that failure would arrive quickly if coordination faltered. The movement restored motion where paralysis had threatened. Units that had been pressing east now drove north, night after night, engines running in blackout, columns threading through chaos. The relief of Bastogne became the symbol of that motion, a moment when initiative returned to Allied hands, and the German narrative of surprise began to fracture. To many observers, this looked like instinct made flesh. But Patton's speed was not temperament alone. It rested on staff work drilled to precision, on logistics bent to purpose, on ruthless prioritization that accepted risk in one place to eliminate it in another. Orders were simple because preparation had been complex. Movement succeeded because someone had already done the arithmetic. Inside Bastogne, the meaning was felt more than understood. A besieged defender heard engines approaching through the frozen forest, sound carrying farther in the winter air. Hope arrived not as speech or signal, but as noise, the unmistakable promise that someone was coming. For soldiers cut off and surrounded, motion itself became salvation. Patton's success ignited American pride at a moment of sensitivity. The relief of Bastogne did not merely stabilize the front, it offered proof. Proof that speed could still decide outcomes. Proof that constraint had not dulled American effectiveness. And proof arrived precisely when British prestige was under scrutiny, following Montgomery's expanded authority in the North. Churchill now faced a dangerous contrast. Montgomery was seen as managing a crisis, steady, corrective, deliberate. Patton was seen as solving it, decisive, kinetic, visible. The difference was sharpened not by propaganda, but by timing. One style looked necessary, the other looked heroic, yet both were required. What could not be avoided was the emotion such comparison generated. Success had rebalanced the battlefield, but it unsettled the alliance. Pride surged where resentment already lived. As German momentum collapsed and the front stabilized, the war against Germany moved closer to its conclusion. But another conflict pressed forward alongside it, quieter, more personal, and increasingly difficult to contain. The coalition was winning, but inside it, something was beginning to strain toward open anger. When the guns quieted after the bulge, the most dangerous fighting moved into language. Bernard Montgomery spoke publicly about the crisis with the confidence of a man who believed order had prevailed because he had imposed it. His words were not careless, but they were ill-timed. To many Americans, they sounded like ownership, of recovery, of credit, of command, at the precise moment when American soldiers believed they had paid the decisive price. The reaction in Washington was immediate and sharp. Patton's relief of Bastogne had become a symbol not just of success, but of national resolve under pressure. Against that backdrop, Montgomery's tone felt dismissive, even if it was not intended to be. In coalition war, intent matters less than reception. What Americans heard was not balance, but minimization. Eisenhower now confronted a crisis no operational map could display. German forces were being contained, but resentment was spreading unchecked. Strategic necessity demanded unity. Human emotion resisted it. He understood that alliances do not fracture in conferences. They fracture in silence, sarcasm, and wounded pride left unattended. Churchill stepped forward before the breach could widen. His task was delicate beyond measure. Britain could not afford to appear apologetic, nor could it survive appearing arrogant. He defended Montgomery enough to preserve British standing, affirming his competence, his role, his necessity. At the same time, he reached outward, signaling to the Americans that victory was indivisible, that no single commander could claim ownership of survival in the Ardennes. Every sentence was constructed as a barrier, not a wall, but a firebreak, something designed to slow the spread of anger before it ignited something uncontrollable. Churchill did not contradict Montgomery directly. Instead, he widened the frame, shifting emphasis away from individual brilliance and toward collective endurance. Here lies the harshest truth of coalition command. Even correct decisions can become poisonous if explained badly. Words allocate credit, but they also allocate legitimacy. In wartime alliances, legitimacy is a form of currency. Spend it carelessly, and trust collapses faster than any front line. Behind closed doors, the damage was visible. Officers who had faced the same enemy now exchanged bitterness in private, as though shared danger entitled them to grievance. Victories were weighed not only against German losses, but against perceived slights. The war was being won, yet something essential was thinning. Churchill's language became deliberately restrained. Praise without excess, loyalty without surrender, correction without humiliation. He neither abandoned Montgomery nor endorsed his tone. Instead, he absorbed the tension himself, allowing resentment to strike him rather than fracture the alliance beneath him. This was leadership stripped of romance. No speeches for history, no dramatic gestures, only maintenance, constant, exhausting, invisible. Churchill realized that at this stage of the war, his most important command was not issued to an army. It was issued to the alliance itself. And keeping that machinery intact, under the weight of pride and loss, was now as decisive as any battlefield victory. As the war moved toward its final phase, the dead were increasingly counted twice, once on casualty lists and again in argument. Market Garden's losses and the bloodletting of the Ardennes became figures with moral weight, numbers invoked not only to measure sacrifice, but to justify decisions and assign blame. Thousands lost ceased to be a description. It became a weapon. In Britain, Bernard Montgomery remained a national symbol. His image was tied to discipline, control, and the promise that British lives would not be spent carelessly. To attack him openly was to threaten more than a commander. It was to challenge the idea that Britain still fought with judgment and purpose. His failures were contextualized, his successes emphasized, his reputation guarded. In America, George Patton became something different, a living rebuttal to caution. His victories were read as evidence that audacity paid dividends, even under constraint. Where Montgomery represented management, Patton represented action. The contrast hardened into narrative, not entirely fair, but increasingly powerful. The deeper lesson lay beneath the comparison. Casualty figures do not merely record suffering. They shape legitimacy. They determine whose judgment is trusted, whose methods are defended, and whose future influence expands or contracts. Numbers acquire meaning when they are placed beside alternatives, real or imagined. Churchill now confronted a strategic paradox with no clean resolution. Britain's dignity required Montgomery's standing to remain intact. An ally seen to disown its principal commander would appear diminished at the very moment post-war influence was being negotiated. Yet American confidence was now indispensable to finishing the war. Without it, unity would fray beyond repair. Churchill needed both, and the cost ledger threatened to undermine each simultaneously. Far from conference tables, the abstraction collapsed into private grief. A bereaved family heard the word necessary and wondered who had been granted the authority to decide necessity. The question was never asked publicly, but it lingered in living rooms and letters, unanswerable and enduring. Strategy, to those who paid its price, remained remote. Officially, the alliance endured. Orders were executed, plans coordinated. The language of partnership remained intact. Emotionally, something thinner replaced trust. Polite cooperation masked grievances that had not disappeared, only postponed. Men who had fought the same enemy carried different interpretations of what the war had demanded from them. Churchill understood this erosion. He did not attempt to reverse it with rhetoric. Instead, he worked to prevent it from becoming fatal. The goal was no longer harmony, but functionality, keeping the machinery turning long enough to reach the end. The lesson was austere, and it offered no comfort. Sometimes the most expensive battlefield is not the one marked by craters and wreckage. Sometimes it is the one inside the partnership, where numbers are weighed, pride is counted, and victory itself is quietly contested. From the outside, the choice appeared simple. One general advanced with speed and visible results. Another had presided over a costly failure. To many American observers, logic suggested replacement, preference, elevation. But Churchill's decisions were constrained by forces far larger than talent alone. Britain, in 1944, could not afford to look like a passenger in a war it had entered first and endured longest. To remove or publicly humiliate Montgomery would have signaled more than dissatisfaction. It would have signaled British decline at the precise moment when Britain's prestige was needed to shape what followed victory. Post-war Europe was already taking form in conversations and assumptions. A Britain that appeared subordinate in command would find itself diminished at the table where borders, governments, and influence were decided. Churchill also understood Patton with unusual clarity. He admired the American general's brilliance, his ability to convert motion into advantage and confusion into opportunity. But he also recognized the volatility that came with it. Patton's temperament won battles. It also produced headlines. In a war increasingly bound to diplomacy, public opinion, and alliance management, that volatility carried risk no victory could erase. The deeper meaning of Churchill's stance lay here. He was not choosing between generals. He was protecting the architecture of the alliance itself. That architecture depended on appearances as much as outcomes, on balance, dignity, and the perception of shared authority. To elevate one figure too openly was to weaken the structure that held everyone else in place. In the quiet hours, Churchill sat at his desk with maps spread wide, cigar smoke hanging low, the war reduced to paper and words. Here, sentences mattered as much as offensives. A phrase could stabilize a relationship. A misjudged emphasis could undo months of careful restraint. Leadership had narrowed into language and patience. The irony sharpened with every report from the front. Patton's victories did not resolve coalition politics. They inflamed them. Each success intensified comparison, and comparison demanded judgment. Judgment, once spoken, could not be withdrawn. Churchill knew that restraint now preserved freedom later. To choose Patton openly would have satisfied a logic of performance. It would also have fractured a logic of partnership. Britain's role required continuity, not spectacle. The war's end required cooperation, not vindication. This was the quiet truth Churchill carried through the final months. His most consequential command in 1944-45 was not an order to advance, halt, or attack. It was a decision about belief, about whom Britain must continue to stand behind so that the alliance itself could stand at all. Victory, after all, was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was whether the partnership that achieved it would survive its own success. In the war's final months, clarity arrived, but not simplicity. Germany was collapsing under pressure from every direction, yet the manner of that collapse revealed two distinct forms of competence. One was the competence of caution, the discipline to preserve armies, to hold ground, to ensure that success did not unravel through haste. The other was the competence of speed, the ability to break an enemy's balance, to deny recovery, to turn opportunity into conclusion. Both had proven necessary. Neither had proven sufficient alone. It was in this balance that Churchill's words, spoken months earlier, gained their final meaning. They were not excuses, nor were they evasions. They were acts of governance. He had been required to turn loss into endurance without turning truth into lies, to absorb failure without allowing it to poison resolve. His language had not rewritten events. It had framed them so the war could continue. Placed side by side, the reputations of Montgomery and Patton resisted easy judgment. Montgomery's failures were real, visible, and costly. Yet so were his necessities, He preserved forces that would still be needed when the war turned unpredictable, when reverses like the Ardennes demanded order rather than brilliance. Patton's victories were undeniable. They broke enemies, restored initiative, and shortened campaigns. Yet they also carried risks, logistical, political, and personal, that could not be scaled without consequence. The final revelation settled quietly. Coalition victory does not arise from perfect choices. It arises from imperfect trade-offs managed without collapse. At continental scale, leaders do not select between right and wrong. They choose between costs, some visible, others deferred. The measure of success lies not in purity of method, but in whether the structure survives the strain. When the war ended, veterans returned home carrying judgments that never appeared in official communiques. Some remembered caution as salvation. Others remembered speed as deliverance. Many carried both impressions at once, unresolved and permanent. History would debate methods. Those who had lived them rarely felt the need to simplify. Churchill's lesson, distilled by the war's end, was austere. Leadership was not the art of praising the best man. It was the discipline of keeping the whole machine from breaking while men died inside it. That machine included armies, governments, publics, and alliances, each fragile in different ways, each capable of failure under pressure. The war against Germany ended in surrender, not argument. But the argument had mattered. It had shaped how victory was achieved, how sacrifice was understood, and how the post-war world would be entered. Unity had not been natural. It had been maintained, word by word, decision by decision, under conditions that punished error without mercy. In the end, the Allies did not agree on everything. They did not need to. They needed only to endure together long enough to finish the task. They counted the dead in thousands and argued over who deserved the triumph, until Churchill reminded them that without unity, even victory could become another defeat.